History remembers crowns and empires, but it forgets that kings and queens had hearts that broke, burned, and betrayed just like ours. Tonight, we whisper through the velvet corridors of palaces, where love triangles toppled dynasties, and passion proved more dangerous than war. A tangle of crowns and hearts. History, when it wishes, behaves less like a chronicle and more like a staged play, one where monarchs, queens, and mistresses stumble into entanglements so theatrical that even the poets blush. Love triangles have never been confined to ballads or tavern songs. Thrones themselves have tilted beneath the weight of longing glances and whispered betrayals. Picture a royal court, marble floors polished to such brilliance that candles appear doubled in their reflection. Courtiers stand at attention, their silks rustling faintly like a restless audience. Behind the veils of duty and grandeur lies a truth often too human. Kings and queens were not immune to tangled passions. They wed for power, for alliances, for dynastic survival. Yet hearts often strayed where crowns could not. In these corridors of velvet and intrigue, every smile could be treason. A misplaced gift, a poem slipped under a door, a hand brushing against another's sleeve, such things could ignite storms greater than armies. For while wars are fought on battlefields, many kingdoms cracked first within their palaces. Tonight, we begin a slow wandering through some of the most infamous royal love triangles the world has ever whispered about. From medieval courts where mistresses held more sway than ministers, to empires undone by jealous heirs, each story is a reminder that even the most powerful were but fragile creatures of desire. And so we draw open the first curtain, where power and passion met in uneasy silence, and where a crown was never protection against the chaos of love. Eleanor, Henry, and Rosamund. The first tale takes us to 12th century England, to a marriage that was both thunderous and brittle, like a storm hovering forever over a valley. King Henry II of England had wed Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable women of her age. Together they were a dazzling pair, she, the Duchess of Aquitaine with her vast lands and unyielding spirit, he, the restless and clever monarch who dreamed of binding England and France under his sway. Yet Henry's heart strayed. In the soft folds of Oxfordshire, tucked away in a bower later immortalized in legend, there lived Rosamund Clifford, known as Fair Rosamund. Chroniclers painted her as ethereal, gentle, graceful, and so radiant that she seemed almost born of myth. The court buzzed with whispers. The king kept a secret garden for Rosamund, reached only by a maze so elaborate that none but he could enter. Whether this was truth or embroidery added by poets, the tale spread like wildfire. Eleanor, proud and sharp as steel, was no queen to be sidelined. Stories grew darker, rumors that Eleanor herself sought out Rosamund, and that one evening she appeared with poison or a dagger. Some claimed Rosamund was forced to choose between death by steel or by cup. Others insisted Eleanor merely sent her away to a convent, where she faded from the world in quiet disgrace. What is certain is that Rosamund vanished, leaving only legends behind. Henry and Eleanor's marriage shattered, though they remained bound as monarchs. Their sons would rebel, their court would fracture, and Eleanor would outlive Henry, watching the echo of their tumult ripple across kingdoms. And so, our first triangle sets the tone: love entwined with power, a queen unbending, a mistress who became myth, and a king undone by his own desires. Philip IV, Joan of Navarre, and the daughters-in-law. If England gave us storms of the heart, France would give us shadows that clung like mist. The court of Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, glittered with power and suspicion in the early 14th century. His queen, Joan of Navarre, was dutiful, politically astute, and a mother to the future kings of France. Outwardly, their union seemed steady. But beneath the gilded surface, a scandal was waiting to ignite. It began not with Philip himself, but with his sons, and the women they married. At the Parisian court, luxury abounded, silken gowns from Flanders, spices carried from the Levant, and a sense that France stood at the pinnacle of Christendom. Yet courtly splendor was also a stage where desire played out in dangerous ways. Philip's 3 daughters-in-law, Margaret of Burgundy, Blanche of Burgundy, and Joan II of Burgundy, were young, vibrant, and bound in marriages more strategic than affectionate. The royal family gathered often at the palace gardens or in the halls of the Louvre, where conversations flickered with coded glances and subtle rivalries. One winter evening, whispers spread that Margaret and Blanche were entangled in affairs with Norman knights, the handsome Aunay brothers. The clandestine liaisons allegedly took place in the shadowy towers of Château de Nesle, an accusation so explosive it came to be called the Tour de Nesle affair. When Joan of Navarre confronted her husband, Philip, the scandal tore open the illusion of harmony. Margaret and Blanche were accused of adultery, their lovers tortured and executed in gruesome fashion. Some said their tongues were ripped out before they met the stake. The princesses themselves were cast into prison. One would die within those walls, another lingered in disgrace. Only Joan too, though accused of knowledge of the plot, was spared. What began as rumor ended in blood and broken crowns. The Capetian dynasty, which had seemed unshakable, began to fracture. Within decades this scandal would ripple outward, contributing to the disputes over succession that flared into the 100 Years' War. Thus, in France, love triangles were not gentle legends but daggers in the dark, personal passions turned into political earthquakes. And once more, we see that kings and queens could command armies, but never their own hearts or the ambitions of those around them. Catherine the Great, Peter III, and Grigory Orlov. From France's somber prisons we turn to the glittering yet treacherous halls of 18th-century Russia, where the fate of an empire hung upon the affections of one extraordinary woman. Catherine II, remembered to history as Catherine the Great, was born a minor German princess. She arrived in Russia at the age of 14, destined to marry the awkward, volatile Grand Duke Peter, heir to the throne. Their union was ill-fated from the start. Peter, later Peter III, was obsessed with toy soldiers, crude jokes, and his idolization of Frederick the Great of Prussia. Catherine, by contrast, was intelligent, ambitious, and steeped in philosophy and statecraft. When they dined together, Peter rattled on about drilling wooden troops while Catherine listened in weary silence, her mind already plotting something grander. The Russian court noticed the mismatch. Whispers followed Catherine as she walked the long galleries of the Winter Palace. Her husband neglected her, and she remained without an heir. In time, her loneliness drew her toward the handsome and commanding Grigory Orlov, a guard officer whose family carried considerable influence. Orlov was no idle distraction. He embodied the strength, vitality, and devotion her husband never showed. By the early 1760s, Catherine and Orlov's bond had blossomed into something that was no longer a mere affair but the foundation of a conspiracy. With Catherine's intellect and Orlov's military backing, they gathered allies in the shadows of gilded halls. When Peter III finally ascended to the throne in 1762, his erratic rule and reckless admiration of Prussia alienated nearly every noble. The love triangle reached its climax one fateful July. Catherine, guided by Orlov and his brothers, staged a coup. The imperial guards declared her empress in St. Petersburg, while Peter, confused, abandoned, and betrayed, was forced to abdicate. Within days he was dead under murky circumstances, almost certainly at the hands of Catherine's allies. Thus, in Russia, love was never confined to private whispers. The triangle between Catherine, Peter, and Orlov redrew the destiny of a nation. Catherine emerged not merely as a wronged wife but as the architect of one of Europe's greatest reigns. Her affair, scandalous though it seemed, was the cornerstone of an empire's rebirth. Mary, Lord Darnley, and the Earl of Bothwell. If Catherine's intrigues were grand and imperial, the tale of Mary, Queen of Scots, was tragic and operatic, the kind of story poets and dramatists would feast upon for centuries. Mary was already a figure wrapped in legend by the time she returned to Scotland in 1561, a Catholic queen in a realm divided by Reformation zeal. She was tall, striking, and charismatic, a woman who could silence a chamber by entering it. Suitors gathered like moths about her flame. Of all of them, she chose Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a tall, handsome young noble with a claim to both the English and Scottish thrones. Their marriage seemed politically brilliant and romantically promising. But appearances frayed quickly. Darnley was vain, arrogant, and resentful of Mary's authority. He drank heavily, quarreled with her council, and demanded a crown matrimonial, a title that would have given him equal power to rule. Mary, shrewd and cautious, denied him. Darnley grew restless and suspicious, especially of Mary's closeness with her Italian secretary, David Rizzio. The love triangle that followed was less romantic than it was explosive. In 1566, Darnley and a band of lords burst into Mary's chambers at Holyrood Palace while she dined with Rizzio. In a scene of brutal horror, they dragged Rizzio out and stabbed him 56 times while the pregnant queen looked on, powerless to stop them. Darnley thought this violent act would reassert his dominance over his wife. Instead, it sealed his downfall. Mary turned away from him, and into the arms of James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a rugged, forceful man whose loyalty and ambition matched her own desperation. Within a year, Darnley was dead, his body found in the garden after an explosion ripped apart the house where he was staying. Though he had not perished in the blast but rather by strangulation, suspicion immediately fell upon Bothwell. Mary's marriage to Bothwell soon after Darnley's death outraged her nobles and scandalized Europe. To some, it looked like love. To most, it looked like murder wrapped in passion. The union cost Mary her crown. She was imprisoned and eventually forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. Her tale ended in England, under the wary eye of her cousin Elizabeth I. Decades later, the axe would fall at Fotheringhay Castle, and Mary's tumultuous romances, betrayals, and gambits became immortal, an enduring warning of how love and power rarely coexist without blood. Elizabeth I, Robert Dudley, and Lettice Knowles. If Mary Stuart's love life ended in blood, her cousin and rival, Elizabeth I of England, orchestrated hers as a carefully guarded performance. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, wrapped herself in an image of purity and independence. Yet, beneath the polished surface of monarchy, whispers of scandal and longing traveled through every court in Europe. At the center of it all stood Robert Dudley, her childhood friend, confidant, and perhaps the great love of her life. Tall, handsome, and ambitious, Dudley had been at Elizabeth's side since her earliest days on the throne. Foreign ambassadors, watching from the wings, wrote letters suggesting the two were inseparable, that Dudley's shadow was never far from the Queen's presence. He was given private apartments near hers at court, a privilege none could ignore. But there was a problem. Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived quietly away from court. In 1560, she was found dead at the foot of a staircase, her neck broken. The suspicious circumstances ignited a blaze of gossip. Was it an accident, suicide, or something darker? Many whispered that Dudley had orchestrated her death so that he might marry Elizabeth. The scandal was so fierce that any thought of union between them became politically poisonous. Yet Elizabeth never let him go. He remained her favorite, showered with titles and influence, always dangling on the edge of something more intimate. Then came the cruelest twist. In 1578, Dudley secretly married Lettice Knowles, Elizabeth's own cousin. When the Queen discovered the truth, her fury was legendary. She banished Lettuce from court, calling her a she-wolf who had dared to steal what belonged to the crown. Elizabeth never forgave her, though she continued to keep Dudley close, unable, or unwilling, to sever the bond entirely. Thus, Elizabeth, Dudley, and Lettuce formed one of history's strangest triangles, one fueled less by passion than by possession. Elizabeth, who never wed, made her courtship with Dudley both an emotional entanglement and a political strategy. Foreign suitors could be teased, negotiations prolonged, because the Queen seemed always on the brink of marriage. Yet, in truth, she belonged to no one, and perhaps that was her greatest act of control. But when Dudley died in 1588, the same year the Spanish Armada threatened England, Elizabeth kept his last letter in a treasure box beside her bed until her death. For all the public denial, for all the refusal to wed, the small, faded note suggests that in private, the Virgin Queen's heart had been far less untouched than her legend declared. Henri IV of France, Marguerite de Valois, and Gabrielle d'Estrées. If the Tudors gave Europe scandal wrapped in velvet, the Bourbons gave it passion splashed in wine. Few monarchs embodied this better than Henri IV of France, a man whose heart seemed too restless to beat for just one woman. His reign was a tapestry of charm, affairs, and political compromise, but none of his entanglements captured the drama of his love triangle with Marguerite de Valois, his wife, and Gabrielle d'Estrées, his mistress. Henry's marriage to Marguerite, sister of the infamous Catherine de' Medici, was doomed from the beginning. Their wedding in 1572 should have united France, but it was overshadowed by one of history's bloodiest nights, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when thousands of Protestants were slaughtered in Paris. Henri himself, a Protestant, barely escaped alive, forced to convert to Catholicism for his survival. Marguerite was brilliant, beautiful, and ambitious, but theirs was no love match. She detested his affairs, and he grew weary of her sharp tongue and schemes. Then came Gabrielle d'Estrées, the luminous mistress who transformed Henry's private life. Described by contemporaries as both clever and enchanting, Gabrielle became more than a fleeting dalliance. Henri showered her with gifts, estates, and devotion. He wrote letters that read like poetry, confessing that she was the one who gave him peace in the chaos of kingship. For years, she was treated at court almost like a queen herself, attending ceremonies and receiving honors that scandalized the nobility. Marguerite, meanwhile, was left sidelined, married to a man who openly flaunted his mistress. She spent years in estrangement, imprisoned at one point for her intrigues, yet she refused to vanish quietly. When Henri eventually sought annulment, Marguerite resisted fiercely before finally agreeing. She released him not out of forgiveness, but because she knew she had lost the battle for his affections. But fate played its own cruel hand. Just as Henri prepared to marry Gabrielle, she died suddenly in 1599 while pregnant with his child. Henri was devastated. He wept openly, declaring her his true wife in all but name. Yet even grief could not stop the machinery of monarchy. Within a year, Henri remarried, this time to Marie de' Medici, who would bring him wealth and heirs. Thus, the triangle of Henri, Marguerite, and Gabrielle was resolved not by choice, but by tragedy. Yet it revealed something essential about kingship. Even monarchs, cloaked in power, could be undone by the simple tangle of love, jealousy, and loss. For Henri, a man who claimed Paris was worth a mass, perhaps Gabrielle had been the one thing worth a crown. Louis XIV, Louise de la Vallière, and Madame de Montespan. If Henri Iv's heart was scattered across his affairs, his grandson Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, turned love into theater. Court life at Versailles was not merely about politics. It was a stage where whispers and glances carried the weight of treaties, and the king's passions shaped the fate of noble families. And in that golden hall of mirrors, two women, Louise de la Valliere and Madame de Montespan, found themselves locked in one of history's most glittering yet cruel love triangles. Louise had been the king's first great love. Shy, modest, and pious, she had not sought the king's gaze, yet it fell upon her like sunlight. She became his mistress in the early years of his reign, when he was still shaping his identity as monarch. To many, their bond seemed genuine. Unlike the calculated flirtations of the court, Louise gave Louis something simple, affection untangled by politics. She bore him children and endured the humiliation of court gossip with quiet dignity. But Versailles was a place where innocence withered quickly. Enter Françoise Athénaïs de Roquecourt, better known as Madame de Montespan, brilliant, dazzling, and utterly unlike Louise. Where Louise was timid, Montespan was witty. Where Louise lowered her gaze, Montespan met the king's eyes with daring. She embodied the very opulence Louis wanted Versailles to radiate. Soon, she eclipsed Louise, becoming not only his mistress but also the uncrowned queen of the court. The triangle was merciless. Louise, still in love, was forced to watch as Montespan strutted through the palace, dripping in jewels, wielding influence over ministers and courtiers alike. Montespan's sharp tongue made Louise the subject of ridicule. Yet the king, torn between tenderness for Louise and the magnetic brilliance of Montespan, allowed both women to orbit his life far longer than most courts would have tolerated. In time, Louise broke. Her health waned, her spirit faltered, and she sought refuge in religion. At last, she withdrew to a convent, where she lived in repentance, describing her years with the king as sinful chains she had gratefully cast off. Montespan, however, basked in her triumph, until whispers of witchcraft and black masses stained her legacy. Rumors claimed she had dabbled in dark rites to secure the king's affection, sacrificing everything for her hold over him. Louis, the monarch who believed himself ordained by God, found his conscience troubled. Slowly, Montespan too was edged from his heart and replaced by yet another, the pious Madame de Maintenon. The once gilded triangle dissolved into bitterness, regret, and prayer. And yet, the triangle of Louis, Louise, and Montespan left an indelible mark. It was the perfect mirror of Versailles itself, glorious, decadent, and haunted by shadows just beyond the glow of candlelight. Edward II, Isabella of France, and Piers Gaveston. The English court of the early 14th century was no less dramatic than Versailles. Here, the stage was set for one of the most infamous royal triangles in medieval Europe, though it was not defined by two women vying for a king, but by a queen contending with her husband's male favorite. Edward II of England was a monarch of contradictions, physically strong, fond of rustic pastimes like rowing and digging, yet ill-suited to the brutal chess game of medieval politics. Upon his accession, his heart was already claimed, not by his young bride Isabella of France, but by Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose charm and wit captivated Edward completely. Isabella, daughter of the formidable French king Philip IV, entered her marriage expecting the dignity and influence of queenship. Instead, she found herself sidelined. Edward lavished titles, lands, and affection upon Gaveston, making him Earl of Cornwall, while Isabella was left humiliated at court. Chroniclers recorded the scandal with relish. Gaveston, dressed in finery finer than the queen's, mocked the great lords with biting nicknames, and accompanied the king at every turn. The barons seethed. To them, Gaveston was not merely a personal favorite, he was a dangerous usurper of influence, the wedge driving apart king and queen. Parliament demanded his exile, yet Edward could not bear to part with him. Time and again, Gaveston was sent away, only to return by the king's side, as though England itself could not separate them. Isabella endured this with growing fury. She was clever, politically shrewd, and unlike Edward, understood power. To her, Gaveston was not just a rival in love, but a threat to her son's future, her dynastic honor, and her very survival in the treacherous game of medieval rule. The triangle ended in blood. The barons, tired of Edward's defiance, captured Gaveston in 1312. Without trial, they executed him on Blacklow Hill, leaving Edward devastated. The king's grief was profound, but Isabella's relief was not to last. For Edward soon found new favorites, men like Hugh Despenser the Younger, whose corruption and cruelty would lead Isabella herself to rebel. In a dramatic twist, Isabella allied with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and led an invasion against her husband. Edward II was deposed, the first English king forced from his throne, and imprisoned. His death, shrouded in grotesque rumors of torture, remains one of the darkest tales of royal downfall. Thus, the triangle of Edward, Isabella, and Gaveston was more than a scandal of passion, it reshaped the monarchy of England. At its heart lay a truth that monarchs often ignored: the personal is political, and love triangles at court could topple kings as swiftly as armies on the battlefield. Shah Jahan, Mumtaz Mahal, and the shadows of the harem. Across the deserts of India in the 17th century, another triangle took shape, not born of betrayal, but of devotion so intense that it eclipsed every other bond, leaving the rest of the royal harem in bitterness and silence. Shah Jahan, before he was emperor, was Prince Khurram, and from the moment he laid eyes on Arjamand Banu Begum, later known as Mumtaz Mahal, chosen one of the palace, his heart seemed to bend entirely toward her. Though he married other women, as royal duty demanded, it was Mumtaz alone who was his confidant, advisor, and companion. Mumtaz was no idle ornament of the harem. Chroniclers describe her as intelligent, politically wise, and unfailingly loyal. She accompanied Shah Jahan even on military campaigns, where she was seen offering counsel in tents amidst the clash of swords. Their union, though bound by dynastic arrangement, grew into a love so rare in Mughal chronicles that courtiers whispered about it as though it were enchanted. But where one light burns brightly, shadows gather. The imperial harem housed other wives and concubines, many from noble families whose unions with Shah Jahan had sealed political alliances. These women, sidelined and ignored, seethed with resentment. In the closed world of the Zenana, every glance, every gift, every gesture carried weight. Mumtaz's supremacy was unbearable for those left in her shadow. Whispers spread of jealousy so sharp it could cut through the silken drapes of the palace. When Shah Jahan granted Mumtaz the emperor's seal, giving her authority to review petitions, rivals muttered that the empire itself was being ruled by love. Lesser wives plotted quietly, trying to turn influential courtiers against her, though none could rival the emperor's devotion. But devotion has its price. In 1631, while giving birth to their 14th child, Mumtaz Mahal died in the city of Burhanpur. The emperor's grief was catastrophic. He withdrew from court, his hair turning white within weeks, and his heart consumed by sorrow. The harem's jealousies dissolved into silence, for without Mumtaz, they had lost the battle they had never truly won. Out of this grief rose the Taj Mahal, the marble mausoleum that became the world's most enduring symbol of love. Yet behind its perfection lies the memory of that triangle, one woman elevated so high above all others that she drew their envy like moths to flame, and a man whose devotion was so complete it reshaped the very landscape of India. The triangle of Shah Jahan, Mumtaz, and the silent harem wives was not about betrayal or scandal, but about love's monopoly. How too much devotion to one can stir the quiet fury of many. Louis XIV, Madame de Montespan, and Madame de Maintenon. At the glittering court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, love triangles were less whispered tragedies and more performances staged in the full glare of Versailles chandeliers. Among them, none burned brighter, or darker, than the tangled fates of the king, his famed mistress Madame de Montespan, and her eventual rival, Madame de Maintenon. Madame de Montespan, born Françoise Athénaise de Roquecourt, was not merely beautiful. She was dazzling, witty, and armed with the sort of sharp intelligence that made courtiers lean closer just to catch her words. For years, she reigned as the king's mistress-in-chief, the acknowledged favorite whose presence dominated the glittering halls. She bore Louis many children, who were openly legitimized, a rare honor that cemented her influence. Yet her brilliance cast long shadows. Rivals whispered that her hold over Louis was too strong, unnatural even. When the affair of the poison scandal erupted in Paris in the 1670s, Montespan's name was dragged into the muck. Accusations swirled that she had turned to fortune-tellers, love potions, even dark rites whispered over consecrated hosts to secure the king's devotion. The court reeled, uncertain how much was truth and how much venomous envy. Into this dangerous atmosphere stepped Madame de Maintenon, the governess hired to raise Montespan's children by the king. Unlike Montespan's flamboyant brilliance, Maintenon was quiet, pious, steady as a candle flame. She listened where Montespan spoke, soothed where Montespan demanded. Louis, grown older, found in her the calm devotion he craved after decades of glittering excess. Thus began a silent duel. Montespan, though still glamorous, felt her power waning. The very children she bore became the bridge by which her rival entered the king's heart. Versailles, with its mirrored halls and endless gossip, buzzed with speculation. Would the mistress who had once dazzled the world be cast aside for a governess? The answer came slowly, like the dimming of sunlight. Montespan's influence crumbled, tarnished by the shadow of scandal. Maintenon, ever patient, rose quietly until, it is said, Louis secretly married her after the death of his queen. She who had begun in the shadows ended in near-equal partnership with the king. The triangle of Louis, Montespan, and Maintenon was not simply about passion. It was about the passage of time, about how beauty and wit might rule a court in its youth. But in age, it is devotion and constancy that hold the crown. Versailles, with all its brilliance, still remembered the woman accused of witchcraft, and the woman who prayed beside the king in his twilight years. Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, and Anne Boleyn. Few royal love triangles have shaken nations quite like the one that erupted at the heart of the Tudor court in the early 16th century. It was not just a story of passion and betrayal. It was the spark that ignited a religious upheaval that changed Europe forever. At the beginning stood Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who became Henry VIII's queen. She was dignified, pious, and well-educated, her marriage tying England to the powerful Spanish crown. For years, Catherine held her place as Henry's loyal wife, and he, by most accounts, seemed content. But fate's cruel hand denied them a living male heir. Sons were born and lost. Only one daughter, Mary, survived. In a world where dynasties rested on sons, this failure grew heavier with every passing year. Then came Anne Boleyn. Unlike Catherine's serene devotion, Anne was fire, witty, flirtatious, and clever enough to refuse being cast aside as a mere mistress. She ensnared Henry not only with her dark eyes and sharp tongue, but with her insistence that he must make her a wife, not a lover. The king, already restless in his marriage, became consumed. Catherine represented duty and fading hope, and promised renewal, passion, and perhaps the son he so desperately craved. Thus unfolded a love triangle that was no longer confined to chambers and gardens. It burst into the realm of politics and religion. Catherine refused to step aside. She declared herself Henry's true wife before God, fighting with the dignity of a queen and the defiance of a wronged woman. And meanwhile, held her ground, skillfully manipulating her position, her refusal driving Henry into desperation. What followed was unprecedented. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry tore England away from Rome, birthing the Church of England and declaring himself its head. The personal became political. The private passions of one king restructured an entire nation's faith. Catherine was cast aside, and was crowned, and Europe reeled at the audacity. Yet this triangle ended not in triumph but in tragedy. And, once raised so high, failed to produce the longed-for son. Only her daughter, Elizabeth, survived. Soon, whispers and accusations circled her: adultery, witchcraft, treason. In 1536, and was executed, her head falling before a hushed crowd. Catherine, abandoned, died not long after, her title denied but her dignity intact. Henry, left without either woman, remarried again and again, his heart restless, his kingdom forever changed. This was no ordinary love triangle. It was a triangle that redrew the map of Europe, toppled centuries of papal power, and left a legacy written in both blood and scripture. The Tsar, the Tsarina, and the ballerina. In the glittering halls of Imperial Russia, love triangles often unfolded not in whispers, but under chandeliers and gilded ceilings where everyone pretended not to notice. The Romanov dynasty was no stranger to scandal, and one of the most enduring tales of royal entanglement involved Tsar Nicholas I, his pious wife Alexandra Fyodorovna, and the world of the ballet, where beauty and temptation danced nightly for the eyes of emperors. Nicholas I was a man of paradoxes. On one hand, he cultivated the image of a stern autocrat, guardian of orthodoxy and family honor. On the other, he had a roving gaze that often wandered from the throne to the stage. The Russian ballet, funded lavishly by the crown, was not only a national art form but also a parade of young women whose destinies could change overnight with a monarch's favor. The Empress Alexandra, born Princess Charlotte of Prussia, was delicate in health and spirit. She had given Nicholas children, fulfilled her role with devotion, and yet, she often appeared frail beside the thunderous vitality of her husband. Court gossip whispered that while Alexandra retreated into prayer and silence, Nicholas found solace in liaisons, particularly with ballerinas who glittered like living jewels in St. Petersburg's theaters. One name rose above the others: Maria Taglioni, the Italian-born dancer who captivated Europe with her ethereal grace. While some accounts exaggerate Nicholas's attachment to her, the truth lies in the fascination she held over the Russian elite. For Alexandra, the very idea of her husband enthralled by a ballerina was a humiliation magnified by the ever-watchful court. The triangle was not one of passion alone, but of perception, public dignity versus private desire. In the candlelit boxes of the Imperial Theatre, courtiers watched the Tsar's gaze linger too long, his applause too eager. Rumors raced down marble corridors. Was the ballerina merely a passing fancy, or a rival to the Empress herself? Alexandra, though wounded, maintained her composure, cloaking her anguish in silence. She embodied the suffering dignity expected of a Russian empress, yet every whisper chipped away at the fragile bond between them. This was not the tragic crescendo of Anne Boleyn's fate, or the violent jealousy of Philip II, it was subtler, a quiet erosion. For Nicholas, the ballerinas were passing stars. For Alexandra, each star was another shadow over her marriage. Their triangle revealed something profound: the vulnerability of royal women, forced to live under the gaze of a public that judged them not only by their crowns but by their ability to hold a wandering husband's heart. In the end, Alexandra endured, Nicholas carried on, and the ballerinas passed from stage to memory. But the whispers never quite faded. In Russia's grand theaters, beneath the chandeliers, the ghost of that triangle lingered, a reminder that even autocrats could be undone not by armies, but by the quiet rivalries of love. The Sun King's scorching triangle. Few monarchs embodied theatrical grandeur quite like Louis XIV of France, the self-proclaimed Sun King. His court at Versailles was not only the stage upon which political alliances were forged, but also a theater of desire, where every glance, every smile, every carefully placed fan could alter the balance of power. And in that radiant world, one of history's most infamous royal triangles unfolded, between Louis himself, his dutiful Spanish Queen Maria Theresa, and the dazzling, dangerously ambitious Madame de Montespan. Maria Theresa, daughter of the King of Spain, was by all accounts a gentle soul. She adored her husband with an unwavering devotion, though she often seemed overwhelmed by the splendor and intrigues of the French court. To her, Louis was not just a king, but the sun around which her small world orbited. Unfortunately to Louis, she was more of a quiet moon, present, constant, but eclipsed by brighter lights. Enter Françoise Athénaise de Roquecourt de Mortemart, better known as Madame de Montespan. Unlike the timid queen, Montespan possessed wit, charisma, and a beauty sharpened into a weapon. She did not merely enter a room, she conquered it. Courtiers bowed not just to her title but to her influence, for she knew the art of enthralling Louis as no one else could. Their affair began discreetly, as all such things did, but soon it burned too brightly to hide. Versailles was abuzz with speculation. When Montespan entered the chapel, the queen prayed harder. When Montespan laughed in the salons, courtiers listened closer. Maria Theresa, pious and resigned, bore her humiliation silently, her heart cracking under the weight of her husband's betrayal. Louis adored Montespan with a passion he could not muster for his queen. She became more than a mistress, she was a political force. Ministers courted her favor, poets praised her beauty, and even ambassadors sought her ear before seeking the king's. She bore Louis many children, legitimized with ease, while the queen quietly rocked her single heir in the shadows. Yet with ambition came peril. Montespan's reign as mistress coincided with the infamous affair of the poisons, a scandal that shook France when it was discovered that noblewomen had been dabbling in dark arts, poisons, and even whispered rites of black masses to secure lovers' devotion. Montespan herself was implicated by rumor, accused of having sought love potions, or worse, to hold Louis's heart. Though never proven, the stain was enough to dim her brilliance. For Maria Theresa, the triangle ended not in triumph but in quiet endurance. She remained queen until her death, humiliated but steadfast in her role. Montespan eventually fell from favor, replaced by yet another rival, Madame de Maintenon. Louis, the great Sun King, continued to orbit around whichever star shone brightest at the moment. But the court never forgot this triangle. It was a reminder that in Versailles, love was never merely love, it was power, it was influence, it was survival. Maria Theresa, Montespan, and Louis played their roles upon a gilded stage, leaving behind a tale as glittering and treacherous as the Hall of Mirrors itself. And Jane, and the Ghost of a Queen. In the turbulent corridors of Tudor England, love triangles were edged with steel. Few monarchs embodied that ruthless interplay of desire and ambition better than Henry VIII, a man whose passion for women was matched only by his obsession with producing an heir. Among his 6 wives, 2 are forever locked in a spectral rivalry, Anne Boleyn, the queen who captivated Henry and lost her head for it, and Jane Seymour, the quiet lady-in-waiting who replaced her almost before the axe had cooled. Anne Boleyn had been Henry's obsession for nearly a decade. Clever, vivacious, and sharp-tongued, she was unlike any woman he had known. She refused to be merely a mistress, demanding instead a crown. For her, Henry broke with Rome, defied the Pope, and set England on a new course that would shape its destiny for centuries. But once the glittering prize was hers, the shine began to fade. Anne gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, but failed to produce the much-desired male heir. Miscarriages haunted her, and with each one, Henry's frustration grew. Enter Jane Seymour. She had been Anne's attendant, quiet and modest where Anne was fiery and bold. Jane did not dazzle with wit, but she soothed Henry with soft words and a demeanor that promised obedience. To the king, weary of sharp edges, Jane seemed like balm. While Anne stormed and argued, Jane demurred and listened. It was a contrast that proved fatal. By early 1536, the triangle had reached its breaking point. Henry's eye fell more heavily on Jane, and courtiers eager to curry favor whispered venom against Anne. Charges of adultery and treason were fabricated, painting her as a seductress who had betrayed both bed and crown. History remembers her trial as a travesty, her defense as dignified, and her fall as inevitable once Henry had decided she must go. Anne's last words on the scaffold, spoken with grace, blessing Henry even as the executioner readied his blade, echoed through the court. Within weeks, Jane Seymour stood in her place as queen, the triangle resolved not by compromise, but by death. But the ghost of Anne lingered. Jane gave Henry the son he craved, Edward VI, yet she died shortly after childbirth. Some at court whispered it was divine retribution, that Anne's spirit had not left the palace, that her shadow fell upon Jane's chamber as she labored. Whether true or not, Anne's memory haunted Henry for the rest of his reign. Even centuries later, when visitors walk the Tower of London, guides speak of a headless woman in Tudor silks who drifts along the green, said to be Anne Boleyn herself. And often she is spotted near the chapel where Jane Seymour's effigy rests, as though still circling the woman who took her place. In the end, this love triangle was not merely between two women and a king. It was between passion and power, between defiance and obedience, between the living and the dead. Henry VIII may have chosen Jane, but history never allowed him, or us, to forget Anne. Catherine the Great, Peter III, and Count Orloff. If ever a royal love triangle reshaped the destiny of an empire, it was the one at the glittering, shadowy court of Catherine the Great of Russia. Hers was no ordinary tangle of affections, it was a matter of survival, ambition, and raw power. When the young German-born Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst arrived in Russia to marry the awkward Grand Duke Peter, later Peter III, no one could have foreseen that she would one day eclipse him entirely. Renamed Catherine, she was intelligent, determined, and endlessly curious. Peter, by contrast, was eccentric, immature, and utterly unsuited for rule. Where Catherine embraced Russian culture, Peter remained enamored of Prussian drills and toy soldiers. The marriage was loveless from the start. Catherine, lonely and ignored, found herself surrounded by intrigues. It was within this chilly atmosphere that she encountered the dashing Count Grigory Orloff, a soldier of charisma and ambition. Their affair was not whispered in secret corridors but roared through court gossip, for Orloff gave Catherine what her husband could not: passion, protection, and children who, though never officially acknowledged, were widely believed to be his. This was no mere romance. The triangle between Catherine, Peter, and Orloff became the fulcrum upon which Russia's throne would turn. Peter alienated the nobility with his erratic behavior and policies, many of which seemed to favor Prussia, Russia's enemy. Catherine, shrewd and calculating, saw her chance. With Orloff and his brothers rallying the guards and military officers, a coup was orchestrated in the summer of 1762. It was almost too swift to be believed. Catherine, mounted on horseback and clad in military attire, rode before the troops, rallying them with promises of reform and strength. Peter, stunned and abandoned, fled without a fight. Days later he was dead, whether by accident, neglect, or deliberate murder remains a mystery. But few doubted that the Orloffs had ensured his silence. From that moment on, the triangle was resolved, but its consequences were seismic. Catherine ascended the throne, becoming one of the most formidable rulers in Russian history, her reign a blend of Enlightenment ideals and imperial expansion. Orloff remained at her side for years, though their relationship eventually cooled. He was rewarded with wealth and titles, yet Catherine's ambitions extended beyond personal romance. Still, the legend of Catherine's rise is inextricably bound to that love triangle. A neglected wife, a reckless husband, and a soldier lover whose devotion gave her the means to seize an empire. Wherein Boleyn lost her crown and her head, Catherine took her husband's throne and built a legacy that made her name echo through centuries. And if the ghosts of the past linger anywhere, perhaps they'll walk the gilded halls of the Winter Palace, Peter's spirit muttering bitterly, Orloff's shadow watching proudly, and Catherine's presence still commanding the room, as though to say, "Love is power, and power is love, if one dares enough to claim it." Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony. Few love triangles in history have been so legendary, so entwined with the fate of nations, as the one that bound Cleopatra VII of Egypt, Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony. It was not merely a matter of romance or passion, it was a struggle for power, survival, and the very destiny of the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra was no ordinary queen. Draped in the shimmering splendor of Alexandria, she was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from Alexander the Great's generals. Yet her throne was precarious. Egypt, rich in grain and wealth, was coveted by Rome, and Cleopatra's own family was divided by bitter rivalries. It was into this turbulence that Julius Caesar arrived, chasing the remnants of his rival Pompey. The first meeting of Cleopatra and Caesar has been immortalized in legend. Smuggled into the palace, perhaps wrapped in a rug or a sack of linen, Cleopatra emerged before the great Roman general not as a supplicant, but as a vision of wit, intelligence, and allure. Caesar, nearing 50 and hardened by decades of conquest, was captivated. Cleopatra, just 21, understood that seduction was as much about intellect and charm as beauty. Their union was not simply love, it was strategy. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra reclaimed her throne from her brother. Soon, a son was born, Caesar Ion, whispered to be the child of Caesar himself. For a time, it seemed Cleopatra had secured Egypt's survival through the oldest of treaties, one sealed not with ink, but with affection. But fate shifted when Caesar fell to assassins' daggers on the Ides of March. Cleopatra, mourning and weary, returned to Egypt, her future uncertain. Into this void stepped Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest allies and generals, a man of reckless charisma, courage, and appetite. Their meeting in Tarsus is described with the grandeur of myth, Cleopatra sailing up the river in a gilded barge, veiled as Aphrodite, her attendants dressed as Cupids. Antony, a soldier with the heart of a reveler, was bewitched. Their affair was volcanic. Where Caesar had been calculated and restrained, Antony was passionate and indulgent. Together they lived in excess, dining on gold plates, staging mock weddings, and founding a society called the Inimitable Livers. Yet beneath the laughter and feasts lay a dangerous reality. Antony was still a Roman general, and Rome's Senate grew uneasy with his devotion to an Egyptian queen. Thus the triangle emerged, not only between Cleopatra, Caesar, and Antony, but between Cleopatra and Rome itself. Octavian, later Augustus, saw Antony's bond with Cleopatra as both betrayal and opportunity. He painted Antony as a man bewitched, enslaved by a foreign temptress. The propaganda worked. Rome rallied to Octavian's banner, while Antony and Cleopatra prepared for war. Their downfall came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was outmaneuvered. In the chaos, Cleopatra's ships retreated, and Antony, torn between love and command, followed her, sealing their fate. Defeated, the lovers fled to Alexandria, where Octavian's forces closed in. The end was as tragic as any penned by poets. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded as a captive in Rome, chose her own death, perhaps by asp, perhaps by poison, Their bodies were buried together, and with their passing, Egypt's independence ended. Yet their love, reckless and defiant, lived on. For centuries, it has been retold as both a cautionary tale and a timeless romance. Two hearts that burned too brightly, consuming themselves, and in doing so, reshaping the course of history. Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Thomas Becket. In the annals of English history, there is perhaps no triangle so curious, so fraught with both intimacy and betrayal, as that which entangled King Henry II, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Thomas Becket. At first glance, it was not a triangle of romance in the conventional sense, but one of passion nonetheless. The passion of loyalty, friendship, and perhaps an affection that blurred boundaries. In it, there were no stolen kisses in the moonlight, but rather whispered counsels, shared confidences, and the aching sense of betrayal that can sting even deeper than infidelity. Henry II was a man of restless energy, a king who rarely sat still. He was broad-shouldered, red-haired, and relentless in his pursuit of order and power. His queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one of the most formidable women of the Middle Ages, widow of the King of France, patron of poets and troubadours, and as cunning as she was charismatic. Together, Henry and Eleanor ruled an empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. But their marriage, fiery and ambitious, was not a peaceful one. Into this tempest stepped Thomas Becket. At first, he was Henry's boon companion, his drinking partner, his fellow hunter, his confidant. Their friendship was so close that chroniclers whispered it bordered on love, that Henry lavished more time, gifts, and affection upon Becket than he did upon his queen. Eleanor, sharp-eyed and proud, could not have failed to notice how Becket seemed to stand where she should stand, listening where she should listen. When Henry raised Becket to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, he expected his friend to remain pliant, loyal, and supportive. But power transformed Becket. Cloaked in the dignity of his new office, he became a defender of the church against the king's encroachments. Suddenly, the laughter and camaraderie evaporated, replaced by icy disputes and public defiance. Henry, accustomed to Becket's loyalty, felt the sting of betrayal more keenly than any spear thrust. It was here that the triangle grew sharper. Eleanor, who had long resented Henry's favoritism toward Becket, now found herself watching the unraveling of their bond with something close to grim satisfaction. She, too, had endured Henry's disregard, his wandering eye, his fits of temper. Where she might once have bristled at Becket's place in her husband's heart, she now recognized him as a rival turned enemy. Henry's fury at Becket consumed him. It colored their household and their realm. The end came with chilling inevitability. In a fit of exasperation, Henry is said to have muttered words that would echo through history. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Four knights, eager to please their king, took the words as command. They rode to Canterbury, entered the cathedral, and struck Becket down before the altar. His brains and blood stained the stones of England's holiest church. The news shocked the realm. Henry was horrified, or perhaps horrified at how the world perceived him. Pilgrims flocked to Becket's tomb, miracles were reported, and the slain archbishop was canonized as a saint. Eleanor, for her part, saw her husband weakened, beset by guilt and penance. Some whispered she found grim vindication in the fall of the man who had once eclipsed her. Thus the triangle ended not with love fulfilled, but with blood, sainthood, and the bitter collapse of trust. It was a reminder that the affairs of kings and queens are not always bound by desire alone, but by loyalty, pride, and the delicate balances of power. King Philip IV, Queen Joan, and the shadows of the Templars. If medieval Europe was a stage, then Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, was a monarch who played his role with ice in his veins. Tall, stern, and unsmiling, he seemed almost carved from stone. His queen, Joan of Navarre, by contrast, was lively, clever, and well-liked among courtiers. Their marriage, though political in origin, was not an unhappy one. But around them swirled rumors, accusations, and a love triangle, or perhaps a love hexagon, that became one of the strangest scandals of the Middle Ages. The story begins not with the royal bedchamber, but with the Knights Templar, the famed order of warrior monks who had grown astonishingly wealthy and powerful through their banking networks and landholdings. By the early 14th century, Philip owed them vast sums of money. Some chroniclers whispered that his animosity toward the order had as much to do with envy and resentment as with piety or law. Yet it was in his own household that scandal took root. In 1314, a shocking trial erupted, the Tour de Nesle affair. Philip's daughters-in-law, wives of his 3 sons, were accused of adultery with 2 young Norman knights. The charges were brought by none other than Philip's daughter, Isabella, Queen of England, who claimed she had witnessed the illicit liaisons. The scandal shook France. 2 of the accused knights were arrested, tortured, and executed. The women were publicly shamed, imprisoned, or worse. But why mention the Templars here? Because the entire atmosphere of Philip's court in those years was thick with suspicion, betrayal, and whispers of forbidden passion. Chroniclers at the time, and later storytellers, began to blur the scandals together. Philip's ruthless persecution of the Templars, which began in 1307, was colored by rumors of secret rituals, debauchery, and hidden lovers. Meanwhile, Queen Joan, though not directly implicated in the Tour de Nesle affair, found her own reputation under strain. Some suggested her loyalty wavered, that her husband's coldness drove her to seek warmth elsewhere. Others believed her innocence was genuine, and that she stood as a silent witness to Philip's icy crusade against both knights and kin. Thus, the triangle here was more a tangle of entanglements, a king whose suspicious nature destroyed both his household and one of Christendom's most powerful orders, a queen caught in the shadow of rumors that threatened to stain her name, and the absent but ever-present Templars, whose downfall was forever tied to the whispers of forbidden desires and treachery. The aftermath was brutal. The Templars were broken, their leaders burned at the stake. Philip's daughters-in-law were disgraced, some confined to convents, others fading into obscurity. Queen Joan, though she survived the scandal and was eventually cleared of wrongdoing, never escaped the shadow it cast upon her reign. And Philip himself? He earned the epithet, the Iron King. But iron can rust. Within a year of the Templars' last Grand Master being executed, Philip fell from his horse during a hunt and died suddenly, as if cursed. Chroniclers whispered that it was the vengeance of Jacques de Molay, the Templar leader, who from the pyre had summoned Philip and his line to divine judgment. It was a strange triangle, woven of suspicion, betrayal, and vengeance, a reminder that in royal courts, love and loyalty were often crushed beneath the grinding gears of politics and power. Mary, Queen of Scots, Lord Darnley, and the shadow of Bothwell. If ever there was a tale where romance, betrayal, and ambition wove together into tragedy, it was the story of Mary, Queen of Scots. Her life was a long chain of entanglements, but none burned so fiercely, or ended so ruinously, as the love triangle that involved her husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and the man who would later become her third husband, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Mary was no stranger to political marriages. As a queen who had inherited her throne while still an infant, she had been a pawn of crowns and courts her whole life. After her first husband, Francis II of France, died young, Mary returned to Scotland, carrying both royal dignity and youthful idealism. In 1565 she wed Darnley, a cousin who seemed at first a suitable match, handsome, tall, and with Tudor blood that might strengthen claims to both the Scottish and English thrones. But almost immediately, cracks formed. Darnley's charm was shallow, his ambition boundless, and his temper quick to ignite. He grew jealous of Mary's authority, demanding the crown matrimonial, meaning he would rule Scotland alongside her, not merely as her consort. Mary refused. Worse still, Darnley suspected her of closeness with her trusted secretary, David Rizzio, a musician from Italy who had become one of her most loyal companions. The jealousy turned violent. In March of 1566, Darnley joined a group of Scottish lords in a conspiracy to eliminate Rizzio. One night, while Mary, heavily pregnant at the time, was dining with friends, the lords burst in. Rizzio was dragged away and brutally stabbed to death before her eyes. The murder stained Darnley's name irreparably. But Mary was resilient. She gave birth to her son, the future James VI of Scotland and I of England, and sought stability. Enter Bothwell, a bold, forceful nobleman who had long been a figure of both fascination and suspicion. Some saw him as a loyal defender of Mary's interests, others saw him as ruthless, reckless, and dangerously ambitious. In February of 1567, another calamity struck. Darnley was found dead. His residence at Kirk o' Field had been destroyed by an explosion, but his body was discovered nearby, strangled or smothered rather than killed by the blast. The murder shocked Scotland and remains a mystery to this day. But all eyes turned toward Bothwell. Was he the mastermind behind Darnley's death? Did Mary know of it? Was she complicit, or merely swept along by forces greater than herself? What followed was scandal upon scandal. Bothwell was tried but acquitted. Many believed the trial was a sham. Then, only weeks later, he abducted Mary, perhaps with her consent, perhaps against her will, and soon after the two were wed. The marriage outraged the nobility. For many, it confirmed suspicions that Bothwell had murdered Darnley to claim both queen and crown. Mary's enemies rose against her. Civil war erupted, and within months she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son. She fled south to England, where her cousin, Elizabeth I, kept her under house arrest for nearly 2 decades before her eventual execution. Thus, the triangle of Mary, Darnley, and Bothwell ended in ruin, one man murdered, one man disgraced and exiled, and one queen imprisoned, her throne lost forever. It was a drama worthy of a stage, filled with passion, betrayal, and tragedy, and it ensured Mary's name would live on, not only as a queen, but as a symbol of doomed love entangled with ruthless ambition. The curtain falls on royal love. When we step back from the candlelit chambers and the whispering courtyards of these stories, a strange hush lingers. The royal love triangles of history are not just courtly amusements or gossip dressed in silk. They are echoes of longing, sharpened by power, and stained with the weight of crowns. Kings and queens, for all their jewels and their armies, were not immune to the same frailties that keep mortals awake in the night. They loved fiercely, they envied bitterly, they betrayed quietly, and often they paid with their thrones, their peace, or their very lives. Cleopatra risked empire for love, Eleanor risked scandal for passion, and Mary, Queen of Scots, gambled everything, only to be undone by ambition and suspicion. Each triangle held its own peculiar geometry. Sometimes it was a queen caught between duty and desire. Sometimes it was a king torn between loyalty and lust. Sometimes it was 3 lives locked together like stones in a river, grinding each other down until all that remained was rumor, legend, and silence. And yet, even in their downfall, there is something deeply human about them. For who has not felt the pull of a choice that cannot be made cleanly? Who has not tasted the sweetness of a love that comes at the wrong time, or the bitterness of jealousy when a heart strays? The royals merely had their struggles painted larger, their mistakes magnified until they shaped the fate of nations. As the night settles, perhaps the lesson is a quiet one. History's crowns did not shield hearts from breaking. Thrones could not soften the weight of desire. And even the grandest halls, marble, gold, echoing with music, were, at their core, filled with people not so different from us, people reaching for affection, fumbling with loyalty, and fearing loss. So we leave these royal chambers now, closing their heavy doors behind us. Their intrigues are over, their candles burnt low, their voices faded into the dust of time. What remains is the murmur of their stories, half cautionary, half consoling, reminding us that love, in all its tangled forms, has always ruled the world more surely than any crown. Sleep well, dear listener, and let the past rest beside you like a gentle dream.